face on.
Okay.
What number?
23.
23. Up.
No.
Up one.
Up.
No.
Oh, they moved. Wow. Okay. There we go. As I walk the same walk close to thee, just a closer walk to thee. Gratitude is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and care, if I no longer care, would it be my burden share? None but thee, dear Lord, none but thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. When my evil life is o'er, time or evil be no more. God is every safely home, to thy kingdom shore, to thy shore. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, Lord, let it be.
Beautiful. You're all sing so
Yeah.
sweet. I mean, it's getting a smaller group, so it's it's hard to.
That's the same hour.
Mm-hmm.
What's next?
Let's see here. I think we'll do. What did I pick out? Number 6, I think.
Mm-hmm. I like this one.
It's a wonderful day, day I will never forget. When I was wandering in darkness away, Jesus, my Savior, I met. Oh, what a tender, compassionate friend, Jesus in need of my heart. Shadows dispelling, with joy I am telling, He made all the darkness depart. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. When at the cross my Savior made me whole. My sins were washed away, and my life was turned to day. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. When heaven came down and glory filled my soul.
Okay, number 14. I think there's only one or two. I don't know.
That is the
Majesty. Majesty.
Yes.
Worship His majesty.
Oh, sorry.
Worship His majesty. Unto Jesus, the Almighty, now and then. Majesty, Jesus is Lord, now glorified, King of all kings. All right.
I came from this corner room. What? Okay.
Yeah, he's so we do 3 songs at a time.
I know that, but there was one I was going to have you. This one. Number 22. I honestly do not know the tune to that one.
So you want to hear
I just want to hear it. I want to be able to.
Okay.
I'm supposed to be leading.
Oh,
the show.
on my lamp. All right.
They're very good one. Okay.
I love this song.
Okay. I'm not.
This is an
I
old.
hear it.
This is an old Jesus movement song.
Oh.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. Hear it.
Give me oil in my lamp, keep it burning, burning, burning. Give me oil in my lamp, I pray. Give me oil in my lamp, keep it burning, burning, burning. Keep it burning till the break of day. Sing Hosanna, sing Hosanna, sing Hosanna to the King of Kings. Sing Hosanna, sing Hosanna, sing Hosanna to the King of Kings. In my forward, let me travel for the Lord. Give me gas in my forward, I pray. Give me gas in my forward, let me travel for the Lord. Let me travel for the break of day. Sing, sing, Unction in my gumption, let me function, function, function. Give me unction in my gumption, I pray. Give me unction in my gumption, let me function, function, function. Let me function till the break of day. Sing Hosanna, sing Hosanna, sing Hosanna to the King of Kings. Sing Hosanna, sing Hosanna, sing Hosanna to the King of Kings.
And you have a very strong voice, I have to tell you.
I'm keeping it down. You should
No, I mean, it's great.
Okay, let's turn.
I think I know every other one but that one.
Let's turn to Joshua chapter 6. Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. I forgot.
I was making my
Just
teeth
being
blown
familiar
out.
all the time.
Okay, number 27. I don't know that one either. Are we supposed to catch up with what's going on?
There's been our questions.
Okay, I got all the answers. Oh, yeah, right.
All right.
I know everything then.
So
That's a joke.
warriors of Israel are both spiritually and physically ready to attack Jericho. Remember, they were circumcised and consecrated.
Passover.
Passover, yes.
Ouch.
And the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hands, which is the prophetic perfect tense. What does this mean? That's the answer.
Situation is outside of time.
Okay.
It's a future thing they will transfer, which has already been accomplished on God's timetable.
There you go.
Right. That's
Good.
definitely right.
Just God's timetable is what the bottom line.
Right, right.
Okay, that's what I...
In God's eyes, it already happened.
Mm-hmm.
He's not limited by time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Next, the Lord gives Joshua a very unusual strategy of this battle. So what was the Lord's plan and why it was so unusual?
Well, I don't have it all, I'm sure. He told, Joshua, and told that he was to tell the people to march around the city once and do it for 6 days, each day. The 7 priests were to carry the ark.
The trumpet.
And then the 7 trumpets using, now, my Bible said ram's horns, but you had said the silver trumpets too, so either way. Before the ark. I mean, they were to go, the trumpets were like announcing, da-da-da-da-da-da, And then on the seventh day, they would march around the city 7 times. Let's see here, I got my words all mixed up. Let's see here. Okay, and then when they heard a long blast from these trumpets, from these priests, then they were to shout. Thank you, I'm glad you took that away from and the walls of the city, the people were to shout, literally shout, and then the walls would fall down. So it was in God's control how they were able to overcome their enemy, so to speak.
Okay.
And then as you go on a little bit, it says, then armed men were to go before the ark, and then they had a rear guard that came after the ark too. So, and also he told them not to shout until he told them to do so, under God's rules.
They have to be obedient.
Yes.
Very good. So it was unusual strategy. They didn't have any.
I know.
It's really.
How'd you fit all that on your page?
I didn't see the scratchings. Very unusual.
Does anyone have anything to add?
Contradiction? I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. It doesn't matter.
Sam,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
The priests were to carry the ark, and typically the ark and the priests and Levites did not go into battle. You know, I thought about something, though. In this situation, it really wasn't a physical battle anyway. God was going to win the battle.
God had won the battle.
Yeah, and when he had, right. But I mean,
But they were never to be among the military people.
also they were never even to be among the military people.
They were not numbered among the military.
Oh, that's true.
Numbers chapter 1.
Plus, the people typically were never to be in close proximity to the ark. And Israel was forbidden to work on the Sabbath. And that was going to be the day that the walls fell down. So.
And the thing came to my mind is on the Sabbath, actually, they had to do it, this specific situation, 7 times more than each of the previous 6 days.
Also, you had talked about the priests carrying the trumpets ahead of the ark. There wasn't supposed to be anything in front of the ark. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
I gave you just a few of the obvious contradictions. There's a lot of contradictions if you go into Levitical law. This thing breaks every rule.
Okay, very good. What does number 7 often represent in Bible?
Completedness. Finished.
Perfection, completion. May answer this.
Sure.
It's your turn.
It's your turn.
Jeff.
I'll tell you some, maybe
Okay.
a little more. 7 is the number of completion, fulfillment, and perfection. The number 7 is used many times in Scripture. The Lord created the earth in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, which set a pattern for the Jewish Sabbath.
Very good. Well, I think it's very good. Okay. But yes, there are many examples, and of course the book which is full of 7s is Revelation. And I have here 7 churches, 7 spirits, 7 candlesticks, 7 stars, 7 lamps, 7 seals, 7 horns, 7 eyes, 7 thunders, 7 heads, 7 angels, 7 vials, 7 flags, 7 mountains, etc. That's just the book of Revelation. So, and the reason why she said in his outline that the book of Revelation is a book of fulfillment. That's why so many 7s. Okay.
They counted how many pairs of types of 7s there are in the book of Revelation. There's at least 49 sets of them.
Wow.
There's probably more than that, but
Okay. I have a question for you. Remember when Peter asked Christ about how many times
Times
we
to
should
forgive.
Yes, and he says
70 times.
7 times 7. Why he said that? What did he mean?
It means keep forgiving. It's endless.
Yes, unlimited forgiveness, that's one side of it, but
Did it refer back to the
Yes.
Shemitah and
Yes.
the
Very good.
Yes, thank God.
Okay, I didn't get it. What you said? What did you say? Refer back.
Well, we talked about the 7 years and then the Shemitah, the years of rest, or the year of rest and forgiveness and all of that. So 7 times, the 7 comes from that.
Why 70 times 7?
The 490, because that was the,
It was
Correct. That was the number of years that they had to pay for by their 70 years of Babylonian captivity. So just like God forgave them all those, Jesus is saying in the same way.
you should forgive in the
You
same way.
Right.
That's me.
Yeah. What kind of trumpets were people of Israel to use while marching around Jericho, and what information does it give us?
Again, I said the ram's horns is what was in my Bible, but then you had said the silver trumpet.
Shofar, your bell.
Right.
So far you bell.
Right.
In my Russian Bible, it says "Truba Yubileyne," which is
I'm
shofar
sorry,
yubel. Well, it's in Russian, so, which means like jubilee trumpet.
Gotcha.
Is it Yovel or Yovel?
I think it's
different places.
I saw that too. I didn't know if I wrote it down wrong or something.
I think unless you know Hebrew, you don't know.
Are the silver trumpets only used in the Jubilee year, or can they be used?
No, they were used also, interestingly, not surprisingly, to some when a certain pattern of sounds came out of them, they used to summon the people to war.
Starts about battle.
Sort of bad.
Okay.
Different signals you could use with them to do different things.
You know, I've seen, I've never been around anybody, but watched people trying to actually blow on a ram's horn. Unbelievably difficult. And to have different sounds or a tune or...
I always liked it for cold guys.
Yes, right.
With a long, that could be...
I heard one of those guys play Amazing Grace. It was wonderful.
Yeah, I've heard that
So
too.
we
That is
figured that
remarkable.
the trumpets used here were Jubilee trumpets. And why is that?
This kind of, I just read something that kind of summed it up. It's talking about the use of that trumpet at this time indicated that, in other words, it was the start of the Lord's restoration, and the Lamb was coming back to its rightful owner.
Yep.
Got it.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, the last one. What do we know about Jubilee year?
Restoration of all things.
What did it include?
Well, there were 49 years, but the 50th year was the year of Jubilee. 7 Sabbath of years between Jubilee years.
Debts forgiven, slaves set free, land was returned to original owner.
Very good.
I had a question, though, about what if husband and wife who are slaves, let's say, okay, they were supposed to return to get the freedom of that year. And it says each one of us would return to your own family. So I suppose wife was supposed to follow the husband. So it does not specify that.
Because the inheritance was through the male
Right.
And they did this every 50 years.
on the 50th year.
Yeah, right. Right.
The land was not to be permanently sold because the Lord said it's mine.
Exactly. You got it. That's the important point.
The question I heard that they never really observed the 50th, and they were punished for that.
That's why they didn't for 490 years, up until the time of the Babylonian captivity. And that's why Jeremiah says you're going to spend 70 years in Babylon because you're going to pay for every year you didn't honor, every 7th year that you didn't honor a Shemitah. That's why they spent 70 years in Babylon.
In other words, they did not observe 70 cycles.
Right.
Okay.
Say again, Jay?
After Babylon, then they did observe it. I don't know. They never did it.
More so.
Not the way they should have.
No.
They never really have.
The intent of it was never really kept.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are we good? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Got your outline?
Yeah.
All right. We're going to finish the chapter tonight.
Really?
We are.
You really think so?
We're going to try. All right. So let's read verses chapter 6, 9 through 14 first. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets. By the way, this isn't in the outline, but you understand that in the book of Numbers, if you add together all the armed men, 20 years and older, okay, if you add them all together in all the tribes, there were 600,000 of them. Wow. Okay? So when you picture this, you have to picture a group of individuals trying to circulate around this little town that must have been miles in diameter. I mean, picture you're in this little 10-acre city, and as far as you can see, every direction, there's military Israeli army. That's what they were looking at.
What I was picturing is all those people being circumcised.
Okay, so verse 10. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth, until the day that I tell you shout. Then you shall shout." So he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. In other words, back in Gilgal. Verse 12, Now Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of God, and the 7 priests carried the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord, went on continually, and blew the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while they continued to blow the trumpets. Thus the second day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp, and they did so for 6 days. All right? So, we see here, we see the armed men, we see 7 priests, we see 7 trumpets, as we talked about the 7s, and of course, the ark, they circle the city day 1, do it through day 6, silent. Now, I'm asking you somewhat of a rhetorical question here as we go further in the outline, but you should ask yourself why. Why should they be silent? And I think that we're going to learn, hopefully, why. Now, first of all, can you imagine the reaction of the people standing on the top of the walls of Jericho?
No.
Now, day 1, they maybe were intimidated. Day 2, okay, but about 3, 4, and 5, what do you think was the Jews were hearing from them?
Right. You fools.
All right, taunting, cursing. Okay, yeah, and so, but despite all of that, they were to keep. So it says not a word. Okay, so this appeared undoubtedly as an absolutely silly strategy to the people of Jericho. And, of course, militarily, it is a silly strategy. Keep your hand in Joshua and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. This has absolutely the hallmark of God all over it, and I'm going to show you why. 1 Corinthians 1. Starting in verse 25. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the, quote, weakness of God is stronger than men. For consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong, and the base things of the world, and the despised. God has chosen the things that are not, that he might nullify the things are, that no man should boast before God. This is God's strategy. This has the hallmark of God all over it. Okay? So I think Paul makes an excellent point there. Now, I want you to go back, since are you still in Corinthians? Go back. Yes. Turn to Revelation chapter 9, or 8.
I think what you just said is also kind of teaching us when we follow God's will and trying to achieve God's goals, we should sometimes ignore the reaction of people to that.
Yes.
And not listen to what people say, really.
Or even your own. Oh, that's dumb. Who agrees with that?
Yeah. This is why I make the statement: in the kingdom of God, the majority are almost never right. It's true. All right, Revelation 8. We read these last week, but I want you to read them again because I want you to see some more connections here. 8 verses 1, 2, and also then verse 6. And when he broke the seventh seal, which seal?
Seventh.
Okay. There was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. Silence. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and the 7 trumpets were given to them. Okay, and then drop down to verse 6. And the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound them. Now, I want you to be thinking as we go through the rest of this chapter, the typologies that are here. They're all through it. The book of Joshua is typological. It's true history, but it's also typological. You're going to see things happen similar to it in the future, again and again. Okay? So it's really an image of what's happening, and it's going to conclude, of course, in the book of Revelation. Now turn, if you would, let's go back to the Old Testament now, to the prophet Haggai, who was right before Zechariah. Haggai chapter 2. I want to show you what I think is an interesting verse. Want some watering?
You're having enough fun over there.
Okay. Haggai 2, verse 6. For thus says the Lord of hosts, once more in a little while I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth and the sea also and the dry land. In the beginning of verse 7, and I'll shake all the nations. All right? Now, keep that in mind. God, it says in the future, he's going to create a shaking. He's referring here in Haggai to the events of the second coming of Christ. Okay, that's the reference in time that he's talking about. But I want you to keep in mind, we got trumpets, we've got silence, we've got shaking. All right. Now, I want you to turn then back to the book of Hebrews. So I can't stay in one testament tonight, can I? The 12th chapter of Hebrews. And I want to show you a couple verses that I think are very fascinating, how the author, who I personally think is the Apostle Paul, but at any rate, what he says here. Hebrews 12, starting verse 26. And his voice shook the earth then, but now he has promised, saying, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Where do we get that verse? Where does that come from?
It says, Exodus?
No.
Haggai.
Haggai 2, verse 6. Okay? So Paul is quoting Haggai too here. Verse 27, and this expression, yet once more, denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken, of created things, in order that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. In other words, he's shaking the material part of the universe in a way in which he's creating the immaterial part of the universe to come about. Okay? What do we get after the earth is completely shaken in Revelation? We get the new heavens and the new earth. Okay? I'm sorry, Robin, say again. I didn't hear you.
You're getting rid of the material and getting more of a spiritual.
Right, exactly. Verse 28. Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, okay, let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Which, of course, is a very interesting reference to Mount Sinai. Our God is a consuming fire. Now, God will bring his earthly kingdom about with the shout of his voice. So when the people are told to finally shout, who do you think may be shouting along with them?
God.
I think God. Now let me show you again. Let's go back to 2 verses we looked at last week, and I want you to read them again to show you something. Okay? Turn back to Exodus 23. Exodus 23, starting verse 20. This is a prophetic promise. He says, behold, I'm going to send, quote, an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Be on your guard before him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious towards him, for he will not pardon your transgression, since my name is in him. But if you will truly obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies, an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring about to bring you into the land of, and we're going to go over this a little bit later, 7 nations. The Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will completely destroy them. So he says he's going to give this presence, this special person that will be in their midst. So at the end of chapter 5, who shows up?
The general of God's army.
The general of God's army. Also, we believe,
Angel of
is a
God.
theophany, Christ. He shows up, and he says he's going to be among them. I think he's in the marching order. I think he's circulating with them, right along with them.
Do they know that?
Well, they're promised it. They had this.
They must.
What did he say? In the very beginning of Joshua, he said, I
I
will be with you.
That's right. I will be with
He
you.
encouraged.
I have to agree with that,
Mhm.
because it certainly wasn't the shout of the people that brought the walls down.
Nope.
No.
So with the Lord being amongst them, his voice would definitely take
Yeah.
the walls out.
Right. Now,
I also think that they must felt his presence there.
I would think.
Because otherwise, I don't think that 5,000, 100,000 people will be so obedient during 7 days.
that's possible.
Well, I think another facet of this is the fact that they knew at the time of the crossing of the Jordan that the Lord was with them.
Absolutely.
Because there wasn't any way that they could have done that
Right.
without the Lord's intervention.
Without
So
the miracle. Yeah.
I think it's going to be interesting when we go there, but I think that the Lord never left them through the whole thing and beyond.
He says, quote, my angel will be with you. That's the promise we just read. Now, another interesting thing here. My wife pointed this out, and I think it's a very interesting point. And Mikey, I'm certain you have experience in this. When you have an armed service, an armed force, okay, fairly good size, and you're crossing a fairly good-sized bridge, what do you not do?
You don't walk in unison.
Exactly. Why?
Because the vibration on the bridge will bring it down.
Absolutely. Harmonic vibration.
Yes,
I think the Lord's shout was harmonic vibration,
I think so too.
and that's why it tore the walls down.
But even to this day, I think that the Lord has never left his people.
No. I will be with you always, even until the end of the age.
Very good.
All right, back to Joshua. Let's read the next set of verses and go through them.
What's
Fif-
interesting,
Okay.
too, this generation that was coming into the land did not cross the Red Sea.
Except for a couple of them. Right.
Right, and
Yeah.
they are crossing, the Jordan is now being parted. So that
Right.
was
A
a
new
new
miracle for them.
It was a new miracle for them.
Yes. Okay, 15 through 21, let's read. Then it came about on the seventh day that they rose early in the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same manner, but 7 times. Only on that day they marched around it 7 times. And it came about at the 7th time, 7, 7, 7, 7, when the priest blew the trumpets, 7 of those guys, 7 trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city shall be under the ban, and all that are in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from things under the ban, lest you covet them and take some of the things under the ban, so you would make the camp of Israel accursed and bring trouble on it. But all the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord, and they shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the priests blew those trumpets. And it came about, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, that the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, and young and old, ox and sheep, and donkey, with the edge of the sword. All right. So again, we see this pattern goes on for 6 days without change. By appearance, for the first 6 days, it appears that nothing is happening. Right? It appears nothing's happening. Until, of course, the time of the right time, the time of accomplishment, the time of restoration occurs. Now, I think we see a typology here also, and you don't have to necessarily turn if you don't want to, but in 2 Peter 3, 8 through 9, it's the quote where Peter says, "But to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years." Okay?
And 1,000 years like a day.
Exactly. You see, and many people have said that this may be Peter giving us a hint here that there's going to be a total of 7,000 years of human history. 6,000 will be, quote, normal human history, okay? But the 7,000, of course, will be different, because that'll be the millennial age. And, of course, you can make a fairly strong argument for that in history. But, now again, we see here on the 7th day is the 7th day of the sevens. Right? 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. And of course the walls collapse. Turn to Numbers 23. Hold your place in Joshua and go back to Numbers 23. Verses 21 and 22. Starting at 21 here. "He has not observed misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and the shout of a king is among them. The shout of a king, right? Okay. And that's, of course, what brought the walls down. Now, God places Jericho under what in the English we call the ban. In the Hebrew, it's the word cherem, C-H-E-R-E-M. It means two things equally. It means that which is accursed and that which is devoted. Both. Okay? So,
in Arabic language, haram means sin.
Means sing?
Sin.
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 Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting too, because that's certainly what it also involves too. The result of. Of course, the reason why that Jericho was under the ban is because God declared it to be the Lord's first fruits. Why is it that it was his first fruits?
It's when they were back in the land. It was the first city to be
It was the
taken.
first city, and it was his battle, his war, his strategy, and so the city was his first fruits. Now, we see, the first place we see this, interestingly enough, remember the principle of the law first mentioned, go back to Genesis 14. I think there's a very interesting analogy here, typologically. Genesis 14, starting verse 16. Now, Abraham has a battle against 5 kings. Now, if you look at the number of Abraham's troops, which I think are, 318, verse 14. He quotes battles 308 with 318 men, 5 different kings and their armies, and wins. Okay? Now, I'm not going to go into this right now, but if you look at the names of each one of these kings and take them in their Hebrew, you're going to see that every one of them were tribes of giants.
I think you mentioned that before.
If you break their names down, they're all tribes of giants. So this is a supernatural victory over a mortally unconquerable force brought about by God. So in verse 16, and it says, he, Abraham, brought back all the goods and brought back his relative Lot with possessions and also the women and the people. Verse 17, and then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out and met with him at the valley of Sheba, which is interesting because the valley of Sheba, it's an ancient word for the Kidron Valley. Okay? You know what the Kidron Valley, remember what it is? The Kidron Valley is the valley that is directly east of the walls of Jerusalem, in between the walls and the Mount of Olives. That's the Kidron Valley. So they meet right in this place, okay? Right in the Kidron Valley. All right? Verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, okay, king of Shalom, that's the word in Hebrew, of peace. In other words, the Prince of Peace, okay?
Jerusalem.
All right, Jerusalem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. Again, another enigma here. He's a priest and a king. You're not supposed to be able to be a priest and a king. Those offices are never supposed to mix, except in Christ. All right? And he blessed him. Who blessed who?
Abraham.
Melchizedek
Blessed Abraham. Right. He blessed him, saying, blessed be Abram of God Most High. Now notice what he tells him. Possessor of heaven and earth. An interesting statement. And blessed be God, that is Jehovah, Yahweh, Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands. So here we have a supernatural war over, okay, a supernatural victory. And who shows up? A supernatural person and the first fruits are given to him. Right? And this is the same in the book of Joshua. So, all right, so go back to Joshua chapter 6. Now, so at precisely the right time, everyone shouts, the walls collapse. And it's interesting that in Hebrew, well, I'll turn there. You got to read this. In Hebrews 11:30, it says a very interesting statement. It says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. Now, why is that interesting? I think it's particularly interesting because of what's said in the beginning of Hebrews 11. By faith we understand that the worlds, the word there is plural in the Greek, and it means both material and the spiritual world, both. The worlds were prepared by the Word of God so that that which is seen was not made out of things which are visible. In other words, the material was made out of the immaterial. It was the Word of God, the voice of God that called into being the physical world. All right? Called into being. So this is part of the definition of faith. That's why when we pray, we rightfully pray a spiritual action, an immaterial action, about things which are material. Because the spiritual can change the material. Right? That's the way the world was created. All right? Make sense? All right. So, we see here that the immaterial shapes the material. Of course, after this, the walls come down, they run into the city virtually unopposed, and they kill women, children, and animals. Now, how do you feel about that?
Well, if you don't know God, if you don't believe in God, if you're not a Christian, that could make a challenge. It's the children that bother me.
All right, now.
But you're following what God says.
Yeah, that's true.
You're doing exactly
Okay.
what He asked you to do.
Now,
Well, there's only two kinds of people on the face of the earth. The saved and the unsaved.
Did He not want the generations to continue? Is that why the children had to be destroyed also?
all right. Now, let me say this before we go into this, because I'm going to give you a lot of verses to look at concerning this, all right? This is an example of where the liberals of the world hate the Bible. This is where the liberals say God is unjust, He's unfair, He's mean-spirited, He's nasty, He has no consideration, no justice at all. And they take verses like this, and they conclude the God of the Old Testament is evil and nasty and horrible, and the God of the New Testament is gracious and loving and forgiving. And of course, they say that because they're completely ignorant. They have not read very much to come to that conclusion. Now let me show you a whole bunch of verses why this is not the case. First of all, let's start in Deuteronomy 18. Not very far from Joshua. Deuteronomy 18, and we're going to start in verse 9. This is God's definition of the problem of the people that He's going to conquer in the land. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you should not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire. You know what that means? It refers to the worship of the god Moloch, where they would take this metal statue, put fire, build a fire inside of it until its outstretched arms were red hot, and then take their newly born child and put it on the stretched arms and sacrifice it. That's what the Canaanites did. Okay? He says, and also one who uses divination, right, a medium, and one who practices witchcraft, that person who casts spells, and one who interprets omens or a sorcerer. So what are you getting now, just so far, about the nature of the people in the land?
Morally corrupted.
Not only morally corrupted, they're absolutely sold out to the demonic.
Right.
Absolutely sold out. Verse 11, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up from the dead. That's necromancy. Okay, the technical term we use. Verse 12, for whoever does these things is detestable to the Lord. And because these detestable things, the Lord your God will drive them out before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For, verse 14, for these nations which you shall dispossess, listen to those who practice witchcraft and to diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do so. So number one, we learn that these 7 nations, okay, were absolutely, completely taken up with the occult in every imaginable way. That's number one. So not only the morally corrupt, and we have plenty of archaeology that proves the level of pornographic images and statues also among these peoples. It was horrific. I mean, you're talking about statues of bestiality, of incest, of every imaginable kind of moral crime. It's just horrific moral corruption. Right? These are the people we're talking about here. All right? Now, secondly, we suffer in this verse from our own position in the space-time continuum and its limitations. In other words, we are judging God from the standpoint of only knowing the moment in time that we see and are unable to see the future. And I'm going to give you an example here. All right? God is outside of time, of course, and he orders these things. So here's my question. What if God had ordered you in 1915 to kill a specific German child and you refused to do it because it seemed wrong and immoral and cruel to you? But you later learned that the child's name was Adolf Hitler. Was it cruel? Which is more cruel?
That if sometimes God takes kids early because if he didn't take them then they would grow up to be bad.
A serial killer? Mm-hmm. Who knows? The point is, if someone, you have to understand that God knows the future, not us. Okay, we only judge the justice of it by our point in time, but we can't see the future. So it's completely ridiculous and unfair that we judge God when he knows the beginning from the end.
Okay, repeat that again. God knows the future, he says, and we judge the correctness of God's actions by our limited perspective in time. It doesn't seem right to me that he'd do that right now.
Or at all, yeah.
We judge his actions by
our limited perspective in time. That we're caught in time. Right?
So, but we've moved from Genesis, where Genesis 11:12, where they were trying to build the Tower of Babel,
mm-hmm.
and corruption is just multiplied.
Absolutely. And if God hadn't torn down the Tower of Babel, there would have been way more corruption a whole lot earlier. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because that was an absolute tower to the occult par excellence. Mm-hmm. All right, now, I want to talk to you about some other considerations about the idea of the ban, or what is the Hebrew term, the karim, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 9. You're already in Deuteronomy 18, probably. So just go back a few chapters to Deuteronomy chapter 9. And we're going to read verses 4 through 6. God says, do not say in your heart when the Lord your God has driven them out before you, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. But it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. It is not your righteousness, verse 5, or your uprightness of your heart that you are going to possess this land, but it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is driving them out before you in order to confirm the oath which God swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay? So, that's number one, the reason.
So Israel was morally not too good too, but those were even worse.
Way, way, way worse. Okay? And secondly, I want you to notice something. Turn to Deuteronomy 20 and Deuteronomy 9. And we're going to read verses, well, you don't necessarily have to read all of them, but starting verse 10. 20, starting verse 10. Now when you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. And it shall come about if it agrees to peace with you and opens it to you, then it shall be that all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And he goes on. So in other words, the 7 nations, he says, annihilate. Mm-hmm. But all the other peoples in the land that were not the 7 nations, he says they have an opportunity to surrender to you and not be under the ban.
Also, it says about everyone but those 7 nations.
The 7, they're under the ban, period. But everybody else, it can avoid it.
And how do we learn that those 7 are
I'll show you.
under the ban?
I'll show you. Okay? Now, here's the next thing. Turn to Deuteronomy 7. Mm-hmm. Here's your answer. Starting verse 1. When the Lord your God shall bring you into the land which you are entering to possess it, and shall clear away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God shall deliver them before you, you shall defeat them, you shall karim them, utterly destroy them, put them under the ban. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. So, the only instruction here of the 7 under the ban are the 7 that are listed. Others, one can make peace with. They can surrender, in other words.
So there were more than that?
Oh, yeah. There are all kinds of different peoples in the land.
What was the name of the people that they ended up making an agreement with? Because
The Gibeonites.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a very, we'll talk about that.
So
That's
they
a
didn't fall under the ban, not necessarily.
So
Okay.
these
Well-
people, were these people the worst of the worst?
No, they didn't fall under the ban exactly, but
They were still
well,
supposed to be destroyed.
they were.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
and says.
I'm sorry.
I said these that are listed to destroy, were those the worst of the worst, shall we say?
Yep.
They
Those are the detestable
They were
things.
stronger than them.
Well, yes,
Right.
but they were the ones that, remember we read the whole list of demonic things? Mm-hmm. Those were the 7 that practiced them absolutely. Beyond all else, yes.
Was that part of the problem is they never did destroy all the people in the 7 and then they started
Yes. Correct.
And they,
Yeah.
got
They didn't.
infected.
They got infected. That is exactly right. That is an excellent way to put it. All right, now, fourthly, nations could actually completely avoid judgment if they simply repented. I don't know if you want to turn, well, let's turn there. Jeremiah 18. Book of Jeremiah. chapter 18. And it's verses 7 and 8. It says, at one moment I might speak concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom to uproot it or pull it down or destroy it. But if that nation against which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent concerning the calamity I plan to bring on it. Nineveh. That's, of course, the next thing I have here. Jonah chapter 3, verses 4 through 10. Nineveh was a horrendous place. Talk about archaeological information about the Ninevites. They were the absolute sworn enemy of Israel. Okay? The Assyrians. And yet, they repented, and God said, you'll not be judged. All right?
Yeah, that was a remarkable story.
It was. Now, interesting.
He was mad.
Yeah, that's true. He was mad because it didn't turn out the way he wanted. Okay? Also, we see that Israel itself could be put under the ban. All right? Back to Joshua. Turn to chapter 7. Which we'll start next week. I'm just going to give you a little preview here.
Is it the
Yeah, it's the story of Ai. Okay,
AI.
Look at chapter 7, verse 11. Israel has sinned. They have also transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. Because then it goes on and says they stole the things under the ban. And then notice, drop down then to verses 24 and 25. They identify this guy that did it named Achan. Okay.
11, what did it say?
Chapter 7, verse 11, and then verses 24 and 25 of chapter 7. Drop down to 24. And Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, the son of Zerah, and the silver and the mantle and the bars of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that belonged to him, and they brought them to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, why have you troubled us? The Lord will trouble you this day. And all Israel stoned them with stones, and they burned them with fire after they'd stoned them with stones. In other words, that family was put under the ban. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So Israel could be put under the ban also. They sinned excessively.
His family probably were co-criminals.
They were co-criminals. Also, finally, we see that God makes rules for fair treatment of captured people.
Mm-hmm.
Turn to back to Deuteronomy chapter 21. I find it so fascinating how the liberals talk about the unfairness of God, and yet what I see is the unbelievable mercy of God in so many places. That does he allow slavery? Yes, for a limited period of time, with a lot of rules to it. You can't abuse your slave. You can't mistreat you. I mean, he puts limits around these things. In Deuteronomy 21:10 says, when you go out to battle against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them in your hand, and you take them away captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, that'd be my wife, and
He's going for bread.
that's right, and have a desire for her, and would take her as a wife for yourself. See, I told you. Then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall also remove the. Did she shave your? Yeah, that's true. Well, we forgot to shave your head. Okay, and she shall also remove the clothes of her captivity. And the reason why is because they were sometimes they involved amulets and occultic material and stuff like this. They had to get rid of it all. Okay, and then it says, and she shall remain in your house. It goes on and talks about the conditions, and she ends up having privilege, even though she was a captured person. If you decided that you married her or wanted to marry her, then she had all these rights, even though she was a Gentile. It's like Rahab. Okay? So, Point.
Solomon's wife brought him down.
Yeah, they sure did. That's for sure. So, what I'm trying to say to you, again, is, you look at this idea of the ban, and of course the superficial view is how terrible and primitive could God be? But that's not at all the case. If you understand the purpose, the reason why, the limitations, the options, and all these other things, God had a very specific. This was not Canaanite-wide genocide. It was not. It was only 7 nations that were under the ban. Okay? All right, now, let's look at the New Testament application of this. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I've been in these arguments with liberals about these kind of things, and the thing that comes across overwhelmingly to me, and sometimes I've just flat out said it to them, is, you know something? Sir, your problem is you absolutely do not understand the Bible. You might want to read it more before you make your argument, So, 1 Corinthians 10, verses 14 through 20. Look at the application Paul gives us here. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to a wise man. You judge what I say. Is not the cup of blessing which we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break a sharing in the body of Christ? Communion. Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body. For we all partake of one bread. Of course, who is the bread of life? Christ. Look at the nations Israel. Look at the nation of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices sharers in the altar? What do I mean then? That a thing sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? Verse 20. No, but I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice to, they sacrifice to demons, and not to God. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons.
Okay, explain.
What he's saying is that the Gentiles in their sacrifices, particularly now we're talking about Greek culture, Greek gods and demigods, okay? Aphrodite and all of these, Zeus and all of these temples and all these rites and sacrifices, okay? Paul says their sacrifice are to demonic entities. They get their power from demonic entities. All right? So he makes clear that what's really behind it, it's not just some weird ritual. It's actually demonic in nature. And he says immorality, ultimately, has a demonic nature. Okay.
So what he's saying is, like, you guys are not part of that.
Right.
And should not.
Stay away. Go back to Joshua, and we'll finish this off. I told you we're going to get through this tonight. Joshua chapter 6. We'll read the last 5 verses here, starting at 22. And Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the harlot's house and bring the woman and all that she has out here, as you have sworn to her. So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. They also brought out all of her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the city with fire, and all that was in it, only the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron, they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all that she had, Joshua spared. And she's lived in the midst of Israel to this day. For she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son he shall set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land.
Question.
Yes.
The walls came down, right?
Yep.
Rahab's house was on the wall,
Yes.
but they went into the house to get her. God preserved her house?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why I'm saying it could, in my opinion, people have argued whether this was an earthquake. I do not believe it could be an earthquake. How do you have that localized an earthquake, frankly? I think that it was a vibrational system from the voice of the Lord that was directed. And therefore, it was not directed to a certain part. Because remember, they knew what the part was, because why?
That's right.
Because the cord was outside of the window, on the window. All right? That's my opinion.
Well, I've heard, too, that the walls didn't necessarily fall this way, that they went into the ground.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the impression is that they more or less disintegrated. Yeah.
Well, people speculate about
That would be vibrational energy,
how
wouldn't
it
it?
happened, but from what
And
we
the
learned that
soldier-
there was 34 times, I mean, they went under ground to 34 levels. It's almost impossible to figure out exactly what happened when
Yeah.
and when.
Yeah, that's why it's tough to figure out very much about the archaeology of Jericho.
But one thing we do know is that when the walls fell, that the soldiers were able to go straight ahead
Exactly.
as to where they were.
Right.
So there must not have been a lot of debris
Right.
laying around on the ground because
Right.
they wouldn't have been able to do that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I
Maybe
wondered
God
about that. I was
just
wondering
opened the
like how
ground
far
up
they
and
had to
put it
climb
in.
up. And
No, I think it's
I'm just professional. Thank you, Mike. Yeah,
so.
Thank you, Mike.
Joshua keeps his promise to Rahab, and they avoid the ban. Of course, here again is an image of being saved from judgment or God's grace. The city is burned. As we said last week, it's confirmed by excavations because we know that there's a 1 meter ash layer that has been discovered all around Jericho. And the silver, the gold, the bronze, and the iron are a, quote, tithe to the Lord's treasury. Now, does it not make also sense? Everything was burned except silver and gold and bronze and iron don't burn. So they're going to sit there and go through the fire, right? They may be changed in shape some, but they're still going to exist through it. Now, here's an interesting thing. And that's verse 26. Let's read it again. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who raises up and builds this city Jericho." Remember what part of it. He's going to say what part of it particularly. He says, and with the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation. Okay? And with the loss of his youngest he shall set up its gates. In other words, rebuilding the walls again. That's what he's referring to. Now, this is a rather interesting thing. But what you find, turn to 1 Kings chapter 16. God's prophecies always come to pass. 1 Kings chapter 16. This is a time of probably one of the lowest times in Israel. This is the time of our dear King Ahab and his wonderful wife Jezebel. And I tell you, you talk about, this woman is the predecessor to Hillary Clinton. I mean, she is one bad person.
I've never heard that before. That's a good one.
Don't
Jezebel.
remember that one, honey.
Yes, I will.
Now, here's the interesting thing. Let's see. We want to look at verse 34. 1 Kings 16, verse 34. So, this guy named Hiel, okay, in his days, Hiel, the Bethelite, built Jericho. He laid its foundation with the loss of Abraham, his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. This is 530 years after the prophecy was given by Joshua. 530 years later.
So does that mean during that period of time no one even tried to do that?
The city apparently was occupied to some extent after that, but we have no evidence that the walls were rebuilt. Okay? So we read in 1 Kings the first time they tried to fortify it with walls again. And it cost them exactly the way that Joshua said it would cost them. So, the last verse says, and Joshua became
known
through all the land. In other words, these events spread to all the Amorite groups, and the fear of the Lord and the fear of Israel spread to them all. So that is the 6th chapter. So next time, which is not next week, but next time we will take the 7th chapter, the battle at Ai, which is a very interesting and remarkable setback. And we learn something about sin in the process of this. So we'll take the 7th chapter.
I was going to mention.
Yes.
It's also, for the center.
Be Christmas.